Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. I'm going to have a chat which will include feeding. So before you all run for cover, it's not about what, it's not really about how often, and it's not even about the effect. So what's left then? What's left is what's in your pot and where you grow. This has a dramatic effect on what, how often you feed, and the water. The water quality always comes into this, whether you like it or not. So let's start from growing outside, which I don't do. But I'm very aware that there are some real bonuses of growing outside. But there are also some downsides which you can compensate for. So you can take advantage of those downsides. Okay, so if you're growing outside without some sort of roof shelter, there are times when your plants are going to get rained on. Yeah, and they're going to get wet. Very wet. This might go on for some considerable time. Yeah? So anything that was in your pot relative to trying to feed your orchids has just gone. It's just been washed out. Now let's think about what you're growing your orchids in outside, because this is the real killer. If you're growing in something totally inorganic that doesn't hold water, like river stones, pebbles, that type of thing, I'm not including lava rock yet, because it's different. And also the clay pebble type things, hydroton or leca, whatever you want to call it. Now I've noticed, because I got it wrong, that there are two types. You may not have come across the type I've got, because my clay pebbles hold no water and have no wicking properties whatsoever. I'll bet you haven't come across that before, and I wish I hadn't. But most of the leca that you use, hydroton and stuff like that, it can absorb some moisture and therefore hold some. Yeah? But the likes of your stones, your pebbles and this, that and the other do not hold water to any extent. Yeah? So when you water your orchids, your roots in that environment do not get long to hydrate before it dries out. Now that fast wet dry cycle can be used to an advantage, because it means you can water a hell of a lot more frequently. Therefore you get the choices of the feed you want to give those orchids far more frequently. So you can make adjustments, you can add in some supplements. I'm not saying what. All I will say is that if you're missing out on your calcium, your plants ain't going to do so good. I'll put that one in before I get told off. So if you're in that sort of environment where you've got an inorganic media that holds no moisture, yeah, and you get a rainy period, your orchids are getting starved. And the only way you can stop that happening is intervention. You've got to get in there. And the time to get in there is in between the rain if you can. Because obviously your orchid's going to be soaking wet, your roots are probably fully hydrated, but then they're going to dry quickly if it stops raining. Now that's the time to get your feed in. You can add it in while it's raining if you like, but the chances are it will wash out the bottom before the plant gets hold of much of it. Yeah. So that gets that bit out of the way. I'm not going to spend too long on growing outdoors because I don't do it. Excuse me. You've then got growing outdoors in an organic media of some sort, like bark or bark and moss or moss on its own. This is going to hold quite a bit more moisture, certainly in the case of moss. Yeah? But then you've got an adverse effect that can take place. Because if you're growing in such medias when it rains an awful lot, your roots are going to potentially drown because they are constantly soaking wet and you'll have excluded the air. You know, I've seen how much water moss can hold, and all the gaps in that moss can potentially be full of water. Your orchids are capable of starting to drown under those circumstances. I know that sounds odd, but it's based on the media. And then you have to bear in mind you take great precautions to get your pH right, depending on what you're feeding and when and all that sort of stuff. We've done all that. I'm not going over that again. There's plenty of information out there if you want to go into that, almost too much. But if you've got an organic media of some description, it will have an effect on what you put in there, and it will change it. Yeah? Now, nice new shiny bark doesn't have too much of a dramatic effect. It will also dry quite quickly relative to old bark that may be starting to break down. Moss is naturally acidic, yeah? So would you think it was a good idea in periods where it's reasonably wet, you know, or temperatures are a bit low and you're watering your moss because you think your orchids need feeding? Would you think it a good idea to do one of your low pH feeds, you know, down near the 5.7, 5.8? Think what's going to happen to that acidity of the moisture you've just added when it's already starting at quite a low pH. I can assure you, if you're growing in something like sphagnum, it's going to drop like a stone, and it will probably drop out of the range that's suitable for your orchid to be able to absorb most of the nutrients. There might be an odd one or two that does better down that end, but most won't. Yeah? So, an easy way to compensate is feed at higher pHs, knowing that your media will lower it before it drops out. So you're varying the pH without having to do the work. Your media is doing it for you. Yeah? Providing it's got time. You know, if you're in a situation where your temperatures are up near 100 degrees and it's going to dry in a couple of hours, then those changes are very unlikely to take place to any great extent. Okay, and any organic media that's getting on the old side and is starting to break down will provide acidity into your pot, your root area. Yeah, so again, you know, if you're going to water a plant that's going to stay wet for several days and you put a low pH feed in there, your media is going to drop it down even more. So it might pay to head up the higher end and let the media do the work again. But that's knowing what's in your pot. Yeah, so that's growing outside. Now, growing inside, you've got additional problems that don't happen so much when growing outside, although it could do. And the problems you get when growing inside, certainly in my environment, is I'm always going on about keeping the humidity up. It can actually get too high. Yeah? And the plants will respond by slowing their transpiration rate right down. Because they're in such a humid environment. That will also happen if the environment gets too dry as far as the air humidity is concerned, especially in higher temperatures. The plants will lose their moisture possibly faster than you can chuck it in at the bottom end. Yeah? So the transpiration, that metabolic process that takes place in your plants, is paramount. Because if that doesn't happen, the nutrients you're putting in at the bottom end are not going to go very far, because the plant's slowed right down. So when you've got really high humidity in lower temperatures, the inside of the plant will slow down and your nutrients won't move up through the plant at a sufficient rate to get to the good bits, which are your growing tips. And that's where you can get the problem where, well, I'm chucking loads of calcium in there, but my plants aren't growing very well, and my new growths don't seem to be doing too well. Well, perhaps I'll put some more calcium in. Well, it's no good chucking it in there if the plant can't use it. And therein lies another problem. If your pH isn't right in your pot environment, then some of those nutrients will be excluded. That causes a knock-on effect, because if some nutrients are in short supply because the plant can't absorb them because of the pH, there is potentially an excess of some of the others, and they can become what's called antagonistic, and they stop some of the other nutrients working. They shut them out. So again, I'm putting all the right nutrients in there, but it doesn't seem to be working. There'll be another reason why it's not working. And these are the bits, this is the fine tuning that can help your plants grow better. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. And at this point, I'm going to say I'm going to attach some articles which you can then choose to read or totally ignore. This is down to you. It saves me talking too much. They, to me, seem like good articles, and although they cover all of this subject in one shape or form, the thing I've noticed about these articles is where there is common ground in the articles, there isn't conflict. They agree with themselves, which is always good. Sometimes the article that totally disagrees with everybody else is the one that's right, because it's new information, recently discovered. So it's a bit revolutionary. But, you know, that will eventually either be accepted or not accepted and rejected for whatever reason. But, you know, this is how we evolve and develop the way we look after our orchids. The other thing that one of the articles goes into is foliar feeding. This can have benefits and can do some good stuff. But some nutrients are not readily absorbed through the leaves, leaving the others, which again could lead to some excesses. But some of the supplements are actually utilised better through foliar feeding. Now again, if you're growing outside where you've got good airflow and everything and your drying factors are good, chucking stuff all over your leaves and your canes and your bulbs might be a brilliant idea. But if I did that in here, I would cause far more problems than it would ever solve, because my nighttime temperatures drop right down. And that moisture on the leaves and in the leaf joints may not have dried off yet. And it will take quite a long time to dry off. And that's the point at which your pathogens and bacteria can get a hold, because they've got the moisture they need to breed and grab hold of things. So that's where you can get your rots and bacterial infections. So irrespective of that, I don't foliar feed because it means getting my plants wet. And I avoid getting my plants wet at all costs. My plants stay dry. What I do is keep my humidity at a reasonable level, and that level has to chop and change. Yeah. If you get high temperatures, and I mean, you know, really heading up into the high temperatures, a lot of your plants will shut down, and if they shut down, getting them soaking wet doesn't do a whole lot of good. It's the temperature that's the problem rather than the humidity specifically. So you need to go careful. But low temperatures and very high humidity will also have the same effect. Your plant just sort of stops working properly, yeah, because it's just not right. Those certain plants, the plants love it, like the Mazda Valleys and thing. Anything that comes from montane forests, you'll have a job to overdo the humidity, quite honestly. Some of them are at 80 to 100% nearly all of the time, and that's how they survive. That is their way. But most of the others don't. So what is a well-balanced humidity? Well, you tell me. It varies from plant to plant. But I would say that less than 60% is starting to head out of the comfort zone. And probably above 75 may start to cause some problems, but it is temperature dependent. I mean, I'm currently at 19 degrees out here and I've got 54% humidity. That's dropped down below the 60. That's because the door's wide open and I've got the heating on because I'm flipping freezing today. It's really cold last night and I haven't yet quite got the house up to my comfort zone. Blow the plants, me first, plants second. You believe that, you believe anything. But all these things are factors to bear in mind. But the factor that is most often forgotten is that what's in my pot. Now the next thing you can look at in the what's in my pot subject is I seem to be putting all the right sort of feeds in, and I add in CalMag now and again, and I do all this and it still doesn't seem to be working very well. Well, for it to work well, you've got to have a good root system. It's like I've said, you start in the pot, and if that's right, the plant will grow. Get it wrong in the pot, and it's going to suffer. And we do have to put up with newly bought plants, and we come to repot them, and they've got very poor root systems. Well, if it's got a poor root system, one, it's not going to hydrate very well, and two, it's not going to take in its nutrients very well, because that's part of the hydration process. The nutrients go in with the hydration, transpire up through the plant, get to all the bits the plant needs. But it has to be in sufficient quantities to support the size of the plant. Therein lies one of the problems, where you buy a lovely large looking plant, nice healthy looking thing, but what's going on in the pot prior to you getting it has spoilt the root system. And the plant now can't support itself properly with that sort of root system. So you've just got to get it in a state where that root system recovers as fast as possible. And there are various ways and means. Again, everybody will have their own ideas. What I tend to do is think about, you'll have to excuse the noise, they're building houses across the road, and today they're doing concreting and tarmacking and stuff, so there's lots of hammer drills and angle grinders and great big mechanical rollers going on, and I was trying to pick a gap while they were having their coffee, but I think they've just finished their break. But yeah, you've got to get that root system going, and my idea is to get a plant in the media that I want it in, set up, ready to stay there as long as possible, so that it doesn't need to be disturbed again, and that will give it its maximum time to regenerate its roots. Yeah? Now, if you've got a totally rootless plant, I'm not very good at helping you, because I don't tend to get any of those. I haven't had one of those for so long I've forgotten what it's like to have one. They've all got something going on, even if it's not very good. And sometimes you just have to repot whether you like it or not, whether the root system's not very good, and even if you can't see new roots starting, you've just got to do it because you know that media is so bad. And leaving it in that will do more harm than repotting at the wrong time. Getting some nice fresh media, you know, that's got a reasonable, sensible pH in there, not highly acidic. It's not staying soggy, which will suffocate your roots. Remember I said about roots can actually drown, or orchid roots can. You know, so getting it in a place where what roots there are as comfortable as can be expected is going to do it more good than leaving it where it is. And sometimes you might have to pot it in such a way that it's just to get the root system going, knowing that once it's got that better root system and is in a position to be growing some new ones, you might want to pot it totally differently. You know, if I had a bad cattleya, for instance, that, you know, that really had a lousy root system, rather than putting it in my holy clay pot with large bark and plenty of air, it might need some help, and that might not be the best place for it. So I might pot it perhaps a little more traditionally in a smaller mix, maybe with some moss in there, just to get a root system going, knowing that once I've got to that point, I can pot it in its permanent position easier, and it will, you know, translate into growing on well in its new environment. But yeah, what's in the pot is far more important than what's sticking out the top. And that includes fluffy little blooms sitting on the top. If your media's going off, blow the blooms. If you save the plant, the blooms will come again. I've suffered, before I knew any better, many times by having plants that produced a succession of blooms. And that may have lasted 4 or 5 months. And in that 4 or 5 months, I lost my root system, trying to hang on to fluffy blooms sticking out the top. So you have to bear that in mind. Plant first, the blooms will come later. And on that note, I've repotted so many orchids that are in bloom, and I have never had a problem. The only problem I've ever had is when a plant's actually in bud, and you may get bud blasts by disturbing the root system at that point. Especially on Phalaenopsis, they seem more prone to that. You know, if you've got a spike that's got its first couple of blooms open and the rest are in buds, including some of those little tiny ones that haven't started to expand very much. If you repot that at that time, you may blast some of those buds, but that's the only type of orchid I've ever had that problem on, and only under those circumstances. So I don't think it affects them that bad, quite honestly, repotting when they're in bloom. It's more important to get the roots right. The plant will thank you for it. It'll be happy if you get the roots right. So important to just get what you pot them in suited to the root system, and a place where those roots can grow and be happy for as long as possible before that plant needs disturbing again. Okay, so bear in mind, media that's breaking down is turning acidic, and if it stays wet for any length of time, it doesn't matter what the pH is that you started with, it will drop. So if you started with a low pH, it's going to get even lower. Yeah? There are a few orchids that prefer a more alkaline solution. There's a fair old few of the Paphiopedilums are in that class, where you can get round that. You know, if your media, if you don't think it's the right time to repot it, but you know your media's getting a bit old and tired, then you can sprinkle some stuff on the surface. Yeah? Things like dolomite lime. That'll raise the pH. Yeah? So go steady. But try and think about what state your media is in and what you're chucking in on top of it, because you could have an effect that you're not expecting, and it's that effect that will stop your nutrients getting into the plant and working properly. And it doesn't matter how much you chuck in there, if the plant can't take it on board and use it, it's wasted. And if you're overdosing under those circumstances, thinking my plant's not growing very well, it needs more food, you'll do more harm than good by chucking in larger quantities, because it's just going to sit around in the pot and that will do the roots no good at all. A build-up of salts is probably one of the most damaging things to a root system. You know, you can get to the point where it even burns the roots, you know, so it's better to feed at lower levels far more often. It does far less damage than chucking in large quantities all at once. Plant can only take on board so much, and what it doesn't take on board is left in the pot. And if it's left in the pot, it can do harm to the root system, which you're supposedly feeding to make your plant grow. So there's a balance in there somewhere. That's about it, really. It's important to get what's in the pot right. That's a suitable media that suits you as well as your plant. So like I said, if you grow outside and your plants get rained on quite a bit, expect to need to intervene with the feed, because rain's got next to nothing in it. That's why it's good stuff. It's virtually pure water. But anything that's in your pot's just going to get washed out, which is brilliant. Saves flushing them manually, doing it, you know, artificially. The rain will do it for you. But while it's doing it, it's washing out all the goodness that the plants may have been able to absorb. So you've got to replace it. And if you're not in that environment where the only water your plants get is what you give it, then make sure you don't give it too much. Because I've seen more plants go down through too much water than too little. You know, a plant will tell you if it hasn't got enough hydration, it'll go limp. Yeah, all plants suffer like that, even trees, you know, with big woody stems, they can still droop their leaves, you know, the softer parts. But don't get that confused with too much water, because if the roots are being starved because they're drowning, the symptoms are exactly the same as not enough water. The same thing will happen, because the roots aren't working, and if they're not working, the plant's not hydrated, even though it may be absolutely soaking wet. Yeah. So think about air in your media. Make sure the capability is there, especially with that moss. You know, in lower temperatures you can water moss, and the amount of water it actually holds, it almost becomes irrelevant because the plant's virtually sitting in water because it's taken out all the air gaps. And if it stays like that for any length of time, it will do harm. Yeah? So that's the point where if you are using pure moss, it might pay in the lower temperatures to let it get almost dry before you water, even though it says my plant should never dry out constantly moist. Yeah, constantly moist doesn't mean coming up for the third time gasping for air. Yeah, so go steady. It is possible to have your roots too wet. And what you feed your orchids then comes into play. But the ability for your plants to use it is as important as what you feed them. So you need an environment in that pot that can actually utilise the feed that you put in. And drowning roots is not one of them. Also, roots that stay bone dry for too long, it can have an adverse effect, you know. So it's a balance there. And just get to know your plants, you know, get to know your watering frequency and vary it if your conditions vary. You know, we had a heat wave last year. My watering frequency rocketed. My once a day watering from my mounts in some cases wasn't enough. I ain't got time to do it twice, so they didn't do so well. They had a stall right in the middle of the growing season. Not ideal. There's only so much you can do. Whereas my pots, you know, with like the small bark and the moss, they could stay moist even in that heat for some time. But they were getting dry a lot quicker than they would do with lower temperatures. So you've got to be flexible. You've got to adjust and see what you come up with. And my bottom line has always been the question, are your plants doing okay? And if the answer is yes, wonderful. But always ask, could they be doing a bit better? But knowing how to improve things is a bit of an art form. And as I say, stonking up your feed levels may not be the best answer. There's no good chucking that in the pot if the plant can't use it. It'll do more harm than good. Better to give it frequent lower levels which it can take on board in a nice even way so that it's got a constant supply, replenished as and when needed, rather than stonk up the pot with the stuff and the plant takes up on what it needs and then there's excess, you know, and that'll do harm to your media and probably your roots as well. So little and often, all that sort of stuff. And adjust your supplements, not just because somebody says you need this or you need that, but do use them for a reason that you understand. It's like the kelp, the seaweed stuff. There's not a lot of feed in that, but the other stuff that's in there is flipping useful. You know, the hormones and the auxins and the stuff that's in that seaweed feed can help your plant decide what to do next. How to grow, what to grow, all that sort of stuff, which your fertilizers don't necessarily do. So it's a good additive. But don't overdose. You overdose on that stuff, you can get all sorts of problems in the plant. It'll go wrong. It'll start growing wrong, pushing out distorted growths. It can lead to very distorted blooms, you know, with bits missing and all sorts of things. So don't go mad. Same with anything, a little, now and again. And if you think you've got acidic media for one reason or another and you're not in a position to repot, then do something about it. Make sure you don't chuck in low pH water into a pot that's going to make it even lower. Start higher and let the pot do the job for you. And all I can say is good luck. I mean, I've got a lot more knowledge on this subject than I had 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm grateful for certain individuals for pointing me in the right direction and making me do the work, because I was interested in it. So I was happy to do the work. Not everybody is. Anyway, the articles that you can read or not, up to you. And they're all a pretty easy-going read. They're not all scientific and techie. They're not bad. And they may give you some pointers and may elaborate a bit on what I've said. But look after what's in your pot and the plant will probably do okay. And that is the place to concentrate on, not those nice buds pushing out like these. It's all very well saying I've got a nice bunch of buds. That bunch up there, sticking up there, and those are actually on the same plant. They're just on opposite sides. They're a long way apart, aren't they? I might have to put a tie in there, bring those closer together, because the blooming will be far more attractive if they're closer together. But that's a large number of buds coming on there. 3, 6, I think there's 8 or 9 on there, including one that's got a bit bent. That'll straighten up. 9 or 10, probably similar over there. That's going to be a good show, but it'll be a better show if I adjust those bulbs. And if you just have a quick look at those bulbs, this plant's always grown quite well for me as a Cattleya. You know, it's got some quite smaller bulbs that were there when I got it. These are my growths here, probably, but look at the two that are about to bloom and compare their size and plumpness to what was there before. So I know that one's doing better than it ever has. All I got to do is keep that going, not let it slack off. You know, if the next couple of growths come up after this blooming and they don't seem to be growing as well, I've got to think about why, not just accept it. Yeah, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. That's probably confused more people than not. But, you know, if you're interested in the subject and you want to do a bit of fine-tuning or understand a bit more about what can make a fertiliser go wrong, that's what I'm really trying to get at. It's all very well having I mean, I believe that my MSU fertiliser is absolutely great, and I've seen a dramatic improvement in the whole grow room since I started using it. And that's not guesswork, I can see it. But there are factors which will stop that working properly. That's the things to avoid. It's all very well having a great fertiliser, but if your plant can't use it, you're wasting your time. You know, you're pouring money through the pot and down the sink. So, you know, make sure your plants are in a position to be able to use what you give them, and make sure what you give them is suitable, you know. And I'll leave it at that. Have fun. I've got a bright but not sunny day today, so I haven't got to worry about fans and stuff like that like I did yesterday. That was fun yesterday. I enjoyed that. Look, a minor panic, I would call it, because I didn't realise the sun was as strong as it was. But now I'm aware, I'm ready for it. So it won't catch me out again. And it didn't really catch me out yesterday. I just dealt with it. You know, they just basically upped my air circulation, helps a little cooling effect on the leaves. The shade netting will do that later in the year, but for now, it's probably a one-off. Probably might not get a day like that for another couple of weeks. So whack the fans on, help cool the leaves down, and stick the humidifier on, up the humidity for that point in time. Humidifier's off now, so are the fans. We're just back down to the little computer fans. That's all they need today. They've got good light today without that direct sun. So they're back to normal for this time of year, I would say. And I'll see you next time. And for goodness sake, don't get bogged down with all this feeding and pH and stuff like that. If in doubt, aim in the middle somewhere, you know. But I would recommend that if you don't know what the pH of your water is, it's worth either checking it yourself with a little pH meter or get somebody you know to do it for you. But it's good to know your starting point so that you don't inadvertently do stuff wrong. I mean, some rainwater can have quite a low pH. I have known it. You know, head down towards the 6 mark. Yeah? Well, then you add your fertiliser in, and most fertilisers drop the pH naturally. You know, it means that your watering and your feeding is always going to be at a low pH. You're not ever getting a higher pH dose of feed, in which case some of the elements might not be going into the plant and can cause deficiencies. Yeah? And like I've said, they have a knock-on effect. If you get a deficiency in a couple of elements, it can stop some of the other elements working properly. They all sort of, well, a hell of a lot of them combine. They work together. along with the sugars and things that are provided by photosynthesis. It's a very complex thing what's going on inside the plant. But the most important thing is to make sure the plant's got the choices and it's all in there in some shape or form without bits missing. And I'll say it again, you'll have a job to overdose on calcium. The plant will use what it needs. Yeah, and the only way that calcium can go up through the plant is because transpiration is taking place. The methodology by which the hydration at the base of the plant coming in through the roots travels up and out through the leaves. Without that movement, not much happens. So that's got to be going on. And there are circumstances that will slow that right down. And if you slow it right down, things like calcium will be one of the first things to suffer. Yeah, because it's non-mobile. It can't get to the bits where it needs to be because everything's slowed down inside the plant. So, yeah, a little bit of understanding helps, but too much just gives you a headache. See you next time. Thanks for dropping by.